Hello, and welcome to another episode of Geography Made Easy. In these videos, we try to make difficult topics easy. Today, I will be starting with the chapter Rural Settlements, which is the 10th chapter in the ISC syllabus. However, this video is not just meant for ISC students but can be used by anybody who has this topic in their syllabus. What is settlement? What is the meaning of the term settlement? A settlement is the basic living unit or human residence. That is where people will reside. So a residence, a settlement can be a house or it can be an apartment. So any place where people live, it can be a hut, it can be a mansion, it can be a bunker, anywhere where people live is together the cluster of these residents or houses is called a settlement. Hence, settlements, as I have already mentioned, can be of many scales. They can be very large or they can be small. And in this case, we are not just talking about individual settlements, but a cluster of settlements depending on how many number of houses we have. So we can have one house or we can have a cluster of 10 houses, 20 houses, a few thousand houses. Both will be called a settlement. Usually bigger settlements are called towns or cities. However, for defining towns and cities, we have different or other criterias also. We can have very large villages also, but usually we see that very large settlements are usually given the term towns and cities. And settlements also include the roads which connect them. So when we are talking about a particular settlement, for example, the settlement of Lucknow, when I talk about the settlement of Lucknow, I not just consider the houses there, but I also have to consider also the roads which are connecting Lucknow with other places. So in the syllabus we can see that there are many differences which is there in the book as well as in the syllabus. So this is important for the examination point of view, where they can give you questions where they can tell you to write the difference between two types of settlements. Here we are basically talking about rural and urban settlements, the differences. So in rural settlements, the primary activities is agriculture or any other primary activity such as fishing or anything which is not a commercial activity but or not in the secondary sector. Whereas on the other hand, in urban settlements, people are engaged in secondary and tertiary activities, which is industries, trade, transportation services, and so on. In rural settlements, we can see that the size usually can consist of 2 to 4 houses or a few hundred, and more or less this is one of the criteria which is determining the rural settlements. Urban settlements are bigger. They have few thousands to few lakh of houses, and bigger cities are called metropolis or megalopolis depending on the size, which we will discuss in the urban settlement chapter. The number of population living in rural settlements is also less. So we have 10 to 20 to 1000 persons usually. And this is one of the criteria. No settlement in India can be called a rural or it cannot be called an urban until and unless it has a minimum of 5000 persons living. So the census of India, um, one of the criteria by which it determines which is a town is minimum 5000 people have to live in that particular settlement. Density of population is less, so less number of people live in per square kilometer area, whereas the for the urban settlement, again this is one of the census criteria, which is minimum population density is 400 per square kilometer, persons per square kilometer. So 400 people living in 1 square kilometer, this has to be the minimum density for it to qualify as an urban settlement in India. In rural settlements, modern facilities are often absent, but again, this is changing. We see that the absence is being replaced. We see nowadays that modern facilities are also reaching the villages, but let us, for technical reasons and arguments' sake, just consider that modern facilities are, that's why I use the word often absent. And urban settlements usually have modern facilities, all the high tech hospitals and schools, universities, business houses, employment opportunities. Mostly we see them in the urban settlements because it involves the secondary and the tertiary activities. People live in now we will be talking about the difference um, between rural population, that is population which lives in villages, and populations which lives in cities. So rural and urban population, rural population, they live in villages and hamlets, whereas urban population lives in towns or cities. Primary activity is agriculture, forestry, mining, and secondary and tertiary activities such as industry, trade and transport is factories in case of urban population. A well-knit social structure is seen in rural populations because of the agrarian nature of the society. We see that the intersocial relationships between people living in the village is very well knit. For example, people know each other who live in that particular locality. All of the locality as a community, they are aware about what is going on in the village. And if something happens, which is you, if somebody requires help, as in somebody's unwell or somebody has to go to the hospital or somebody dies, the entire community as a whole, in case of rural population, they will respond to the emergency. So we have a well knit social structure, whereas we have loose social fabric in urban population, where we see that people from different areas have come and settled in this particular area in the urban settlement. And we see that in many cases we don't even know who our neighbor is if we are living in an apartment, but that is never going to happen in case of a village. Mostly rural population has an open and pollution free environment. They live in a pollution free environment. This is a very generalized statement because depending on what kind of activity is going on, pollution can be present. And environmental pollution is much more accurate in the acute in the urban areas, which is absolutely an accurate statement being made, that the pollution problem is a bigger problem in the urban areas than compared to rural areas because of the kind of activities which is being done in the urban areas compared to the rural areas. The rural population may be deprived of modern facilities, and sometimes we do see that from the rural areas, especially very interior areas, we see people coming and taking up employment in the urban areas or coming for higher education, which is because the modern facility is not available in their village. And in urban areas, we see the urban population is enjoying the modern facilities. Now, if we want to discuss about the types of rural settlements, we usually have three types of rural settlements: clustered or agglomerated or nucleated, where we see that all the settlement is they are concentrated in one area, and this can take place due to a number of reasons. We can see that this compaction can take place because of security from invasion. It can take place around a particular resource such as water. So sometimes see in the middle we have a tank, and along the boundary we see settlements growing. So this is the tank. So sometimes we have natural resources around which we see agglomeration or nucleation taking place, or we can also see there can be a temple, there can be a church, which around which, or a mosque around which the city, the village grows. And so, or it can be resource. um, the next type which is seen is semi-clustered, where we see that it's partially there is compaction or agglomeration, and partially we see that there is dispersion. Dispersion is where we see that the hamlets are very isolated. So villages, the people are living in these homestays or homesteads, and they are located far from one another. So maybe we can maybe there is a field in this way. These are fields, and we see that here maybe there are a few settlements here, a few settlements here, a few settlements here, and a lot of space in between. So this kind of settlement is called the isolated or dispersed pattern. Usually we see this kind of settlements in the developed nations, where large land is owned by the farmers. Also we see this kind of settlements mostly in where we see that the terrain is not smooth. So the terrain is rugged, so we see fewer settlements located far away from each other, but mostly commonly seen is clustered settlements and semi-clustered settlements. So, what is the difference between compact and dispersed settlement? Compact is the clustered settlement, and dispersed is the far away ones. So, in case of compact settlements, we see that they are most commonly seen in fertile plains or river valleys. Where the terrain is flat, we see that compaction is more common, and dispersed settlements are commonly seen in mountainous terrain, ridges, forested areas, desert and semi-desert areas, talking basically about um, the hostile environment which leads to dispersion. Compact settlement main occupation is usually agriculture, and in case of dispersed settlement, the main occupation is lumbering, cattle rearing, or agroforestry. In some cases, we do see agriculture also. The houses are located adjacent to each other and form a compact block, which is we see in case of the clustered settlements, which is forming very high dense population in the compact settlements. And in case of dispersed settlements, the houses are located at a distance from each other. They are bigger and they provide more living space. So usually the size of the houses are larger. They have more rooms. They are spacious, and they give more living space to the occupants than compact settlements. In case of compact settlements, fields are small, whereas in case of dispersed settlements, the fields which the farmer is tilling is large. Because the usually between two settlements, the field is the buffer zone, and field or forest area. So usually we see that they are large, but in case of compact settlements, too many people, very high population density, so fields tend to become smaller. In compact settlements, streets are dirty due to lack of sanitation, but again, this is a very generalized statement. Not necessary, but yes, in case of very dense compact settlements, old towns of any cities, we see this problem that there is lack of sanitation because the growth of that part of the rural settlement has been unplanned. Here, we are not talking really of cities, but we are talking of compact villages. But again, compact villages where um, um, may be dirty because of the fact that the growth has been organic, the compaction is high, so it's not very clean. And a dispersed settlement is generally clean and neat. People have a close knit social life in compact settlements, and people live isolated lives, which is very commonly can be understand just by the structure of the settlement, where people are living close to one another. They will have tend to have a very well knit structured life, whereas people who live isolated lives, who live in the dispersed settlements, usually we see that they are not having a very well knit social life. So, factors determining the different types of rural settlements, whether it will be compact or dispersed. So, the first and the foremost and the most important factor in this case is the physical factors, which we have already, when we were discussing the dispersed and the compact settlement, we have already talked about that relief, climate, altitude, drainage, groundwater, depth, soil, they all are determining whether the settlement will be compact or semi-dispersed or dispersed. Um, for example, if we saw that compaction takes place in flat areas compared to you know the settlement being dispersed in areas where the terrain is difficult. Similarly, climate, if it is a very dry climate, we see that around an oasis we see compact settlements taking place, whereas dispersion will not take place in that area. So these factors play a very important role. Next, we have ethnic and cultural factors such as caste and ethnicity, which can also determine whether there will be compaction or dispersion. So in many cases, we see that the settlements have a typical kind of structure, especially in India, which is based on the caste system, with the Brahmins occupying the core of the settlement and the Shudras or the untouchables occupying the far away portions away from the core of the uh, settlement. Now this is because of the caste system which is prevalent in India. So the ethnic and the cultural factors actually play quite an important role, where we see religion, caste and culture is a very rigid and strong point in case of rural population. Historical factors also can play an important role in determining the type of settlement, such as history of conflict and invasion is something which determines whether it's a compact settlement or a dispersed settlement. Usually we see where places which have faced a lot of invasion in the past, we see that the villages tend to be compact. Sometimes there's a boundary wall around the village protecting the village from foreign invaders, or so the invasion has determined what kind of settlement will be formed in that particular area. So we have the different kinds of settlement patterns. The first pattern is the linear pattern, usually following either a road or a railway line or river, where we see that the settlements will be forming along this linear structure. So we have the linear pattern. Circular pattern is developing around an oasis or water body. Sometimes we see settlement can grow around this water body, and we have a circular pattern. Checkerboard or rectangular pattern, where we see that when we have crossroads and when settlement is developing along the crossroads of maybe roads, it can be rivers but usually roads, we see the checkerboard or rectangular potting pattern getting formed. Star-like pattern is when we see roads emerging. For example, if you have a place where or a village which has five roads are meeting at a particular point, and then from there we see that linear settlements are forming along the road, and this kind of settlement, when it is considered as one whole settlement, because with time this settlement will grow and develop, this kind of settlement is called a star-like pattern. And we have the fan pattern of settlements, where we see that the usually on the deltaic fans, when we see that the settlement has grown on the fan, so it has grown in this way, so it has this fan pattern is always seen either on the delta or alluvial fan region in the mountainous areas. So delta, the shape of the delta is mimicked by the settlement pattern, or the alluvial fan is also the shape is mimicked by the settlement developing. Next, we have the terrace or the contour pattern, where we know that along the terrace in the hilly areas, we know that settlement when it is developing along the terrace or a particular contour, and this pattern is called the terrace or contour pattern, because this all the houses are located along the particular terrace or the contour. And finally, we have shapeless or amorphous pattern, where all the other patterns, all the other subtypes are falling here, where we don't particularly have one particular shape. It is a shapeless pattern of settlement. So we look at this map, which where we are talking about the distribution of rural settlements. So basically, we see this is a map of India, where we have the three types. We have the nucleated, linear, and the dispersed. So along the Terai area, that is the foothills of the Himalayas, and all along the coastlines, we usually see the linear pattern. Terai area also we see the linear pattern, because before the very high lofty mountains grow, we usually see that the settlement patterns are more or less flat. Next, we have the dispersed settlements. Usually, as I have said, usually in the hilly areas, in the very hostile parts of India, we see the dispersed pattern. So we see dispersed pattern in the northeast, we see in Kashmir, we see in Himachal Pradesh, we see in Uttarakhand, we see in Orissa, because Orissa has a lot of the eastern ghats and very wild areas, very forested areas. We also see the dispersed pattern in parts of Maharashtra, parts of Madhya Pradesh, and parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat. All the areas here are representing the hostile climatic conditions, where it is difficult for people to live. And the west of the India, which is all the plain areas. So we have the Rajasthan plain, we have the UP, we have the Indo-Gangetic plain, we have the Assam plain, we have the West Bengal plains, we have parts of the Deccan plateau, where we see, which is more or less flat, we see that the nucleated patterns are commonly seen in this area. So the important questions for exam will be the differences between the different types of settlements, as I have already discussed. They can give you the reasons as to why some settlement is located at that particular place, and you can, in this case, you can explain with the help of diagrams. Diagrams will fetch you more marks. uh, Region versus settlement pattern, that means they can give you a map and they can tell you, or they can ask you to point on the map as to places, say, having nucleated settlement or dispersed settlement. They can give you a particular pattern diagram, and they can ask you questions on it, like identify the pattern, mention where it can be seen in India, what is the reason for this kind of pattern to develop, why do you think this pattern is developing, these questions. And finally, we have the map pointing, where they can ask you a state with dispersed population settlements, or a place with nucleated rural settlements. So these questions can also come. So if you have any doubts and questions, please let me know. And if you like my video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. Please feel free to share it with your friends if you find the video helpful. Thank you. See you in the next video.